Député de Rimouski.
The honourable member for Rimouski, Basque.
This is a rotating strike. It's not the end of the world. At this point, workers actually have grievances that they have brought forth, and this government undermined every step of it by announcing ahead of time that they would intervene. The minister is a woman. The minister claims to be progressive. I'd like to remind her that back in 1981, there was a postal strike that lasted, full strike, that lasted for 41 days without intervention from the government. And after those 41 days, there was an agreement that gave, for the first time in the Federal Public Service Union, maternity leave. I'd like to ask the minister if she truly believes that if government at the time intervened and asked for a mediator to come in or an arbitrator to come in, that maternity leave that was non-existent in the whole public service would have been granted to the union.
Mr. Speaker, and I share the member's concern about using back-to-work legislation, although I will remind him that 7 different NDP premiers on 15 different occasions have used back-to-work legislation when they have not been able to resolve disputes between parties. In fact, Mr. Speaker, some members of his own caucus have voted in favour of that back-to-work legislation, and so I know that he understands that this is a very difficult decision for governments to take. Having said that, Mr. Speaker, as I said in my speech, there are many Canadians that are relying on us to restore Canada Post service in a prompt way. That doesn't just include small and medium-sized businesses, e-commerce businesses, but that also includes Canadians in very vulnerable positions in rural and remote communities that have no other way but to get the goods that they rely on into their communities. Mr. Speaker, we will always support the collective bargaining process. We have done so throughout these negotiations, and we are confident that this legislation will allow the parties to continue to work to a deal that they arrive at together.
Hear, hear.
Comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member, l'honorable député de Joliette.
Oui, merci. The honourable member for Joliette. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The International Labour Organization, even the Supreme Court, recognized the right to strike, which is intrinsically linked to the right to negotiate one's working conditions. Yes, those organizations recognize that strikes can cause economic disruption, but it's the price to pay for a balance of power and a negotiated collective agreement. It is the price to pay for maintaining a minimum of social and economic cohesion. When the government adopts back-to-work legislation with time allocation and limits debate, it's just to benefit the Amazons of this world. I don't understand how a government that calls itself so progressive can have such an unprogressive act or bill. They're sacrificing long-term social peace to save nickel and dime our workers. Before I recognize the Honourable Minister, I would like to remind the members that when they ask a question, I don't think I have anything to be ashamed of, so I am going to put the question to the Honourable Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, the member opposite points out that, the right to strike is protected by the Charter. In fact, this union has been striking for 5 weeks, Mr. Speaker. And prior to that, Mr. Speaker, the parties were negotiating for over a year. We provided them with every tool possible. We started with Federal Mediation Service, Mr. Speaker. A variety of different mediators of all different seniority levels helped them through the early conversations. Mr. Speaker, there was still an impasse. I appointed a special mediator, Mr. Speaker. I appointed a special mediator again. I have met with the parties. We have had conversations with the parties. We've worked very closely with the parties. They have been at my disposal to have conversations whenever they wanted to. Mr. Speaker, we know that these parties are very far apart at this point. They have worked at the table, but they are not at a deal. And, Mr. Speaker, Canadians rely on a Canada Post service that is delivering for them, whether it's Canadians in rural and remote communities that are relying on essential goods and services delivered by Canada Post, whether it's small businesses who may not see another year if they can't make the money that they typically make in a Christmas season. These are people, Mr. Speaker. These are people in our communities. These are people who are employers. These are people who rely on Canada Post. Thank you.
Point of order. L'honorable député de Rimouski-Neigette-Témiscamingue.
For
about the similar length, and I do believe that the minister is actually repeating her speech at a much longer pace than what the member said.
That's normally the case in committee, but when it's open like this, it's as long as the question takes and within reason. But I would ask the honourable members to keep it brief, because I notice there's quite a few people who want to ask questions. And while I'm giving directions, I'll ask people to remember to place their questions through the chair. I know it's an emotional topic, and people's emotions get out of hand sometimes, and you start talking directly at each other, and that will not cause nothing but problems. So please remember to place your questions through the chair. Questions and comments. The honourable member for Mississauga Lakeshore.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I would like to thank the Minister for her leadership and for her speech in which she outlined a balanced approach to the mediation arbitration framework, for her recognition of the importance of collective bargaining, and for the strong conclusion that this legislation is a measure of last resort. Just before coming to the House tonight, Mr. Speaker, I had a chance to speak to one of my constituents who is a postal worker and member of CUPW, and she and I spoke about the importance of health and safety for the women and men that work for Canada Post, particularly in the winter months. And I'm wondering if the Minister could share with the House her views of the importance of safety standards within the framework that is being proposed.
The Honourable Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm encouraged by the fact that members from all parties are talking to the members that are members that are represented by the union. There is a variety of different concerns and perspectives out there, and I think those are very useful conversations. So I want to thank the member for taking the time to do that. I will say that he's absolutely right. We have concern for the health and safety of all Canadian workers, and that's why the principle that will be one of the principles that will be provided to the mediator arbitrator is to consider the health and safety concerns of workers and to make sure that whatever agreement is negotiated considers those concerns quite seriously. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for London Fanshawe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to know, through you, from this minister, if she's aware the injury rate of postal workers is more than 5 times that of other workers in the public sector. And many of these injuries are debilitating, very serious injuries. And they're a key reason for the rotating strikes that we've been seeing. Does the minister believe that, given this injury rate, that Canada Post is meeting its obligation to provide a safe work environment? And does she condone the perpetuation of such unsafe working conditions?
Honourable Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my answer is essentially the same as to the member that spoke before her. In fact, yes, we are concerned for the health and safety of all Canadian workers, and we have heard concerns from the union about the health and safety of their members, and we know that that has been one of the issues that has been negotiated around and about, and that is why we have included the health and safety of workers in the principles that the mediator must consider. Thank you.
Questions and comments. We have time for a very brief question. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I've been here the majority of the day listening to the debate that's been going back and forth, and one of the questions I continually ask the NDP is, where is that threshold of knowing that you've done enough work and that it's time to bring in a piece of legislation to move the process along? And I can't get an answer from the NDP. They refuse to give me a straight answer on that. So I'll ask the minister a question along the same lines, which is she confident that everything has been done to the point that we now are required to bring in this legislation? Is she confident that this is the right time to do that?
Well, Minister of Labour.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would say that there still is time for the parties to reach the deal themselves. But having said that, Mr. Speaker, I know that my department and the team that work so diligently at my department have given every effort to help these parties reach a negotiated agreement together. As I pointed out, the mediation services started well over a year ago with the two parties when it became apparent that the two parties were not going to reach an agreement with federal mediation services. I appointed a special mediator. Mr. Speaker, that special mediator was reappointed. He was reappointed again, Mr. Speaker. We have communicated on an ongoing basis with both the union and with the employer, and we know that the time has come that the Canadians rely on this service, so we must take the next step. Thank you.